Hey, Ravi, how you doing, man? Thanks for coming on the show today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Eric.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to meeting you or to chatting with you today. A lot about product analytics, but we'll get into some other things. It's definitely an area that's I love to geek out about. So it'll be a good time.
For sure.
But before we get into it, I want to get to know you a little bit. So kind of tell me where you came from and what got you into the startup game.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good question. Yeah. So by way of background, I'm currently co-founding a company called Airplane. Before that, I was a co-founder of a company called Heap. And so have been working on startups for about a little over 10 years now at this point. And so I started my first company, Heap, in 2013. But prior to that, I was a musician for a couple of years. And prior to that, I was in college. So that's kind of my entire background. And the way I kind of got into starting Heap was a little bit random. A couple of years out of college, I was making music. I was doing that. And a friend of mine from college, who I studied computer science with together in school, hit me up and said, "Hey, I'm working on this idea for this analytics product called Heap. You should work on it with me." Him and I were good friends. We'd worked on several projects together and things like that in the past, but obviously nothing of that scale. And I said, "Yeah, it sounded cool," and I had a lot of free time, so I for him, and it sort of took off a little bit after that. We ended up doing Y Combinator and raising a little bit of money, and then launching a product and getting initial users and then a whole thing. And so that sort of in some ways stumbled into the path a lot more so than I think some people do.
Yeah, awesome. I actually worked with Heap for a little bit, so we can talk about that a little bit more. But I'm interested. Let's talk about music for a little bit. So you're going to school for computer science. How did you get into music, and why did you decide to make that your profession?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, a little bit randomly as well. I made music my whole life, basically as a hobby. And then in college, I used to make electronic music for fun. I put a lot of it online on SoundCloud, YouTube, that kind of stuff. And then so around 2010, 2011, a lot of my songs started getting a little bit popular on the internet, just sort of accidentally. And then so around the time I was graduating college, I started getting offers to play shows and do things like that. And so I kind of kept doing that for a couple of years, but it wasn't necessarily what I was trying to set out to do necessarily.
Did you ever think that was going to become your career?
No, I mean, even when I was doing it, didn't really feel like something I was going to do long term. It felt like something that was a lot of fun to do, and it was really cool that I was getting paid to do something I loved, but it wasn't something I necessarily wanted to do long term.
So electronics, so you were DJing?
Yeah, more or less.
Yeah. Oh, very cool. Yeah, I was a DJ actually for about 5 years.
Oh, cool.
Starting in, I think, like 1999.
Wow.
Started DJing drum and bass. Used to be called jungle back in the day.
Yeah.
And all the way through college and then after college as well. And so I was in Miami and got to a point we got pretty big. I mean, we certainly ran the circuit all over Florida, is where I grew up. But we did the Winter Music Conference every year.
Wow.
And so that was kind of this big, for people who don't know, it's just a huge music festival in Miami every year. And it's where, the big names come from all over the world. It's an industry conference, essentially, is what it is.
Yeah.
But then obviously we throw these big parties. It was a lot of fun. So I was a drum and bass DJ. So it was like not exactly on the main stage, but during that time in kind of the early 2000s, it was a hell of a lot of fun. So
that sounds awesome. Yeah, I mostly made like house music.
So you'd be on the main stage.
Yeah.
But like you, then I said, all right, you know what? Music was my first love, but I went to school for computer engineering and obviously was the more practical career to chase.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
But it's good, right? Because it gives us, well-rounded experience and culture and all that. So you jumped in with a buddy of yours and started creating Heap. So tell me about that journey.
Yeah, for sure. So we started Heap towards the beginning of 2013, end of 2012, that kind of time frame. And so the idea behind Heap was Heap is basically an analytics tool that allows you to sort of track user behavior on a website or your mobile app and sort of figure out, how are people converting, how they're flowing through your website, all that kind of stuff. Mostly selling to product teams, occasionally some marketing teams. There's a lot of other products that sort of solve the same problem, Mixpanel, Amplitude, a bunch of others. But the key sort of thing that Heap did a little bit differently was we allow you to sort of basically track user behavior automatically without having to explicitly write the code or instrument the data that you care about. And so, let's say you have a complicated website or a complicated app, you can install a Heap and then within 20, 30 minutes already start getting useful data that you can do things with. Whereas with a lot of the other vendors, you have to do a lot of engineering work and there's a lot of setup costs to get up and running. And so the time to value is a lot faster and also the maintenance cost over time is a lot lower. And so that was the sort of initial insight. And so Mateen, my co-founder at Heap, came up with the idea. He used to be a product manager at Facebook. And then during his time at Facebook, Facebook has an internal analytics platform that's really similar to the kind of mainstream SaaS vendors, Mixpanel, Amplitude, that kind of stuff, where it's basically an event-based analytics system where you can sort of explicitly track, okay, here's the things in my app that I want to see what's going on. But, especially with mobile release cycles, Mateen found himself at Facebook waiting weeks to get data back on simple questions. And so the idea about Heap was to basically just eliminate that bottleneck. And so he was kind of working on that idea for a little bit. He was actually working with someone else, but just kind of as a side project a little bit, and then ended up not working with that person and was kind of working on it solo for a little bit. But he had been hacking on for a few months, basically, in some form or another. And then he kind of pitched me on the idea and showed me a little prototype of what he built. And I was like, that's really cool. I hadn't had as much like firsthand experience with that exact same problem that he had, but I built side projects in the past and used Mixpanel for them. I even did an internship back when I was in college where I ended up implementing Omniture, which is Adobe's analytics suite, for a company. And so I had sort of seen firsthand, like, hey, this is actually pretty labor intensive and pretty high maintenance, the kind of cost of setting up analytics and maintaining it over time. And so Mateen pitched the idea. I'm like, that sounds pretty useful. And so we started working on that in 2013. We kind of had a prototype out that people could use, maybe Feb or March of 2013. And we did Y Combinator. And so a lot of the other companies in our YC batch were some of our first customers. And so we ended up saying, hey, you're probably in analytics, instead of using Google or Mixpanel or whatever, you should just try using Heap. And so we got a lot of early feedback and usage that way, ended up launching the products, got a lot of traction, not overnight necessarily, but a lot of interest in the concept for a while. After iterating for another year or so, really found product market fit maybe sometime in 2014, and then kind of grew from there.
Yeah, so to kind of detour a little bit and talk about product analytics as a whole. So I spent about a decade in the analytics space, and this has been, I know firsthand how challenging it is to really answer the business questions is kind of the point of analytics.
Yeah.
Someone, a C-level, a founder, or whatever, has some question that's, how engaging is my product? Like, how long are people sticking around? Are people using these new features, et cetera, et cetera? And to translate that question and actually get actual numbers is a heavy lift. I've done it from, building it absolutely from scratch. I've used Mixpanel and Amplitude and Heap, among other kind of, whatever, even like the full stories and the hot jars and the kind of funnel analytics type of tools. And it's different on web, it's different on mobile, it's different on iOS versus Android. It's really, really challenging. But at the same time, it's incredibly valuable because as this is your navigation, right? And this is your validation that what you're building is actually working. So actually kind of a question that I have for you that we can discuss is, if there are startup founders that are, they've launched their product, they're getting traction, and they're trying to implement something to get this insight, what is the right balance or the right stage or the right amount of investment that they need to make to get that clarity?
Yeah, honestly, I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer. I think it's really dependent on the company, the type of product, the sort of like go-to-market model and all that kind of stuff. I mean, like, take a couple of extreme examples. If you're selling pure enterprise software where it's a 6-figure or 7-figure price point on average, and you're doing like highly consultative sales, you have a sort of big customer success process. Honestly, I don't think the analytics are all that important when you're small. You probably have 5 customers, 10 customers, millions of ARR. And so you kind of know them back and forth. You probably spend a lot of time with them. You probably know what's going on a very high qualitative level. I think it's still worth having something like a Heap or a full story or whatever in your product to get sort of that additional layer of insight to make sure things aren't breaking, to make sure you're monitoring all the flows and you're not shipping regressions and that causes you to convert to the tank. But for the most part, you kind of know what's going on. If you do ship a regression that causes some flow to really get broken, someone will email you about it 5 minutes later. On the flip side, if you're doing something that's more SMB or consumer, and your path to getting to $1 million in revenue means having thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of users, all of a sudden now you have like real insight you can draw from analytics. Like you have enough statistical power to find interesting things, and you're not going to find those things purely by having conversations with users. I mean, you should still have those conversations with users. I find that there's no substitute for the qualitative, but I think you should probably have like some mildly robust analytics from more or less day one. I'm not saying like pause your launch or whatever just to get some analytics in place, but spend a few hours instrumenting the 5 top, what do you think of as key actions in your website before you launch the thing, or your app before you launch it, and put something like Heap in place or Full Story or Amplitude or Mixpanel. Honestly, I'm obviously very biased towards Heap, but if you enter all that much, which one? Pick one, implement it, track 5 to 10 things that you care about on day one, and like, monitor them. And then as I think what people do incorrectly is sometimes they over-engineer it a little bit. Like if you're just launching a product, if you have 5 customers, 10 customers, you really don't know what's important and what's not important. Just get something in place, make a best guess, and just be prepared to iterate. That's one of the value props of Heap, really, which is like, we're going to auto-track everything. So because you don't know what's going to be important in advance, you can have the confidence the data is there at the end of the day to sort of answer a question that comes up later. But yeah, I think that's my general thought in the early days. I think like having a much more deliberate, concerted analytic strategy, I think that starts to become a lot more important when you're past, let's call it $1 million or $2 million in revenue. I think at that point, almost any business has enough data to do something interesting with. And also you have, a lot of the early product decision making, I think, in these companies is like, if I think about my time at Airplane or my time at Heap, like Heap came out of my co-founder's pain point. Airplane comes out of a personal pain point that I and my co-founder had here. In some sense, a lot of the early product decisions are like, well, I know we need this because I would have used it, right? It's not the perfect decision-making heuristic, but it gets you pretty far. But at some point, that doesn't last forever. I think once you're 6 months or a year in, you maybe kind of solve that initial problem that you thought you would solve, and then I have to think about how does this generalize, what are the problems people are solving that aren't exactly what I anticipated. And then like, I think the analytics strategy becomes a lot more important.
Yeah. So in my experience, one as a product coach and consultant is we want to be able to map the user journey to some kind of data. So you could call the user journey a funnel, if you will. Yeah. And at every stage in that funnel, you want to understand qualitatively and quantitatively, how are people experiencing the product at this stage and how many of them are moving on to the next stage, why or why not. Right. And so, yeah, even if it's just sort of one KPI through each of sort of the major stages of the journey, that's obviously a good place to start. But then as you get to some level of growth, you get further and further away from the individual experiences. And that's where obviously the statistics come in. Yeah. But one of the biggest challenges at that stage or at any stage really is the cost. These tools are not cheap. It's certainly not cheap to build it, but even the tools that are out of the box, they charge a pretty hefty price tag. So what do you think is, are there platforms that you think we would recommend more for early stage founders, or is there a way to get kind of the essence of what you need without spending too much?
Yeah, it's a good question. They are expensive. Even Heap raises prices a lot over time. I think almost all these tools, Mixpanel, Amplitude, Heap, probably some of the others have free tiers that you can take advantage of. I think you do tend to outgrow them pretty quickly. The other thing is I think most of them have like startup programs as well. So if you're like, hey, we have less than X dollars in funding and Y employees, I think they'll let you have it for free for a year or 6 months or something. So I'll definitely check those things out. At Airplane, not product analytics, but at Airplane, we definitely have, we're sort of in the process of releasing a startup program to kind of mitigate that concern. But even to be fair, after those credits expire, at some point it does become a big price tag. I think like it's useful to think of these things in terms of every company is different. If you're razor thin margins, your bootstrap business, maybe you just can't afford one of these tools, for a lower cost alternative. I know there's tools out there like PostHog, which are open source and allow you to self-host them. So those might be worth looking into. But I think if you are capitalized enough where you're like, we can afford these tools, but they just feel expensive. Often I think, honestly, whichever one of these analytics tools you pick, if you actually put the effort into implementing them properly and like using them properly, the ROI should be far, far higher than whatever the price tag was on the tool and whatever amount of time and money you invested into getting it stood up. You should be seeing material business impact from it. You should be able to, probably once a month, you should be seeing something in there, which is like, oh, wow, I didn't realize this part of our product is so confusing and people drop off there. I didn't realize, our sign-up flow is totally broken in this, locale. I didn't realize, hey, this one ad campaign we're running is driving signups, but they're actually all, low quality or something like that. All those things, you should be gaining those kinds of insights once every 1 to 2 months, and at least once you're at a certain level of scale. And like the revenue and cost impact of those should dwarf what you're paying for.
And they know it, I guess. That's why they charge so much, right? Yeah. They know the value.
Ultimately, you can prove those things. It's the reason the retention rates are pretty high on these tools. Everyone has one, even if they switch from one vendor to another. Very rarely does someone decide we're going to just go without. So I think start on one of the free plans, start on one of the startup tiers, something like that. But you should see that the value is there, and then when it comes time to pay, you might hurt a little bit, but
yeah. So obviously, one is there's the cost. You're avoiding the cost of building the wrong thing. You're avoiding the cost of overlooking some really important signal that you wouldn't have seen otherwise. but then also I really like to use it as a way to validate the decision-making process. So you mentioned, founders have this intuition or this insight of like, yeah, I would use it. And so, of course we need this thing, but we're often wrong about that. And it might only get you so far, but there's always going to be a point at which as a founder, you just become too distant from your customers, or they become too diverse that intuition starts to fail you. And so I like to implement these. So even in like a roadmap where we're looking at what features are we trying to implement, say, well, how are we going to measure this? And then after we launch that feature, we go back and measure it and then say, well, why were we wrong about this? What happened? Why was our decision-making process off? And usually it's because we didn't validate enough, right? Or we didn't iterate, we didn't prototype, we didn't go through the process. We relied on our own intuition, our own opinions. That's like 9 times out of 10 the issue. Sometimes it's, well, we were too narrow-sighted, or we went after too narrow of a persona when we studied this. But that's kind of that moment of maturity where if I come in and I work with a company to implement, these kinds of analytics, it's like, oh yeah, actually, let's look at the things that you thought were going to be super great, and then see how those actually scored. And then let's look at the things that came out of engaging with customers or doing interviews or usability testing or whatever. And those are usually the ones that perform the best.
For sure.
Some kind of obvious reasons, but it's hard when you're in the midst of it to see it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. It is easier said than done from the outside. And there's always this sort of urgency to do things and kind of cut corners when it comes to validation and things like that. But definitely.
Yeah, and obviously, you make this investment in some of these platforms, and there's a heavy lift up front. But once you're there, now that speed to insight is much, much faster. It's a lot easier. I asked this business question. Okay, well, we've already got this platform implemented. We can just tool up a new insight or tool up a new event or what have you, and get that answer much faster. So
for sure.
Yeah, it just takes maybe a bit of a leap of faith and obviously a decent investment. But once you're there, it definitely pays off.
Yeah.
So moving on from Heap, you left that company, and you pretty much right away founded a new company. So tell me about that. Yeah,
for sure. So we started Heap in 2013. I was there for about 7.5 years until midway through 2020. And so my role at Heap changed a lot over time. I spent the first couple of years writing code and building out the product. Once we got past, maybe $500,000 in ARR or so, I actually shifted my responsibilities over on the go-to-market side. So I ended up, we had our sales team, marketing, customer success, solutions engineering, all that kind of stuff. And so I spent most of my time to keep actually doing more of the go-to-market side of things. And so helped grow the company to about 200 people before leaving in 2020. The company's roughly doubled since I left, so it's still doing really well. But I decided to move on at that point. We talked about my background. I was a musician, then I started Heap. Once we reached a revenue scale of 10, 15, 20 million ARR, and those numbers kept getting bigger and bigger, I kind of realized, my forte is not running a multi-100 person go-to-market organization at the scale. I think I thrived best in the early days when it was sort of creative product decisions and figuring things out rather than sort of scaling a thing that works. And so around 2019, we decided to hire a COO. So we brought in a COO named Ken, who ended up taking over my role. And really within probably 60 days of him starting, the level of operational rigor and the predictability with which we hit our goals and things like that just was like kind of night and day. He did a great job. And so at that point, I was like, Ken does most of what I used to do. The additional amount of value I'm going to add is not that high to the company. I still stuck around for another year after that, but decided to leave finally in summer of 2020.
So I jumped in pretty much right after you left then. So I know Ken well, and I helped them with that doubling factor. So getting through scale, I think I think it was like end of 2020 that I worked with them, and I worked with them for about a year and a half or so. And I remember there was, one quarter where we hired, I think it was like 150 engineers or something like, it was just bonkers. And we had to start from scratch basically in the systematic process of hiring engineers at that level of scale. And it was a lot of fun, but you're absolutely right. There was definitely this level of operational rigor that had to be implemented because the company was just going stratospheric or whatever, astronomic. And it was tough, right? Because things were starting to break apart in all these different ways.
For sure.
I was focusing on the engineering organization, but it was, I mean, these are growing pains, right? And they were new growing pains that they hadn't dealt with before. Is okay, first it's getting to product market fit, it's delivery, it's getting to a certain amount of scale, and then holy crap, things are going, completely vertical. And now all of a sudden it's how do we keep things together and also build it so that it can continue to scale,
for sure,
even at multiples beyond that. So yeah, that was a really fun experience.
Yeah, it's exciting. Yeah, I didn't get to see quite that level of sort of scale, but yeah, I left right before it.
Well, you kept your hair and all, so that's good.
Yeah. I got lucky in a way. Ken did a great job, took over the revenue organization, and eventually he, as you probably know, became the CEO of the company as well. My co-founder, Martin, also left about a year after I had left at Heap. So Ken is now the CEO, doing a great job over there from what I understand.
Yeah.
But yeah, I decided to sort of move on and start something new. And so I left Heap in July of 2020, was when my last day was. And then I ended up starting Airplane in December of 2020. So not a big gap. And also a lot of the time in between officially starting the company and officially leaving Heap was actually doing kind of that initial research and validation for the idea. And so when I left Heap, I definitely wasn't intending to start something again so soon, but kind of had an idea that I was excited about. And we went through that kind of validation process. It turns out there was a lot of interest in what we were working on, and so decided to dive in. So I left Heap in summer 2020, started working with a friend of mine named Josh, who is now my co-founder at Airplane. But Josh and I had known each other for a while. Josh had a sort of parallel journey that I did. He was CTO at a company called Benchling, which also was started around 2012, 2013. He also saw them get to a few hundred people in headcount, helped scale up an engineering organization over many years, and then ended up leaving Benchling after 7 years or so in the role in 2020 as well. And so Josh and I started kind of like riffing on ideas and things like that. And the thing that both Josh and I had observed at Benchling and Heap respectively was that kind of one of these persistent pain points that was always there within both companies was just the lack of good internal tooling. And so what I mean by internal tools is all that software that needs to exist in any SaaS company that is not customer facing. And so, if you're Heap, there would be constant issues where, we're working with an enterprise customer and need their trial to be extended. So then someone on the sales team has to be able to click a button and extend their trial. Or, we're working with a customer and they accidentally implement the API incorrectly. They've sent a bunch of data they didn't mean to. Someone on our team has to go in and sort of clean it up. Script to sort of make that work better. Or, people have a bunch of GDPR requests that they need us to fulfill, delete some customer data. They send those to us. Someone on our team has to go and run some scripts to make sure that data gets scrubbed in the proper ways. And so these kinds of like operations would sort of pile up over time. And we had, probably 70, 80 scripts that would get executed on sort of a frequent basis. And then also tons of instances where engineers or people on the solutions engineering team would have to like, go into a database and manipulate some data or something like that on behalf of a customer. And so we did like really great tooling around all that stuff that would allow, like in an ideal world, someone who's on the sales team, customer success team, or support team would have been able to like solve those problems themselves, which would have cut down the amount of time to solve them, cut down the amount of like back and forth within the company, cut down the latency, all that kind of stuff. Also, it wasn't very safe when you have a bunch of like engineers and access to production resources and able to run scripts. We kind of had to do that by necessity, but ideally we would have been able to lock down access a lot more. And so this is kind of a problem we struggled with. It was also something Josh struggled with over at Benchling. And he even built sort of a mini solution to internally there over a couple quarters that made it a little bit safer to run these kinds of scripts and things like that. And so I was talking to Josh about that. He mentioned that was a pain for them. I mentioned it was a pain for us at Heap. And so we spent a good couple months just interviewing engineers and non-engineers at a ton of companies, at just people in our network, big companies, small companies, everything in between. And just kind of sense that at almost every company, not just SaaS businesses like Heap and Benchling, this is sort of like a persistent problem. Really any cloud company, which is basically every company these days. So, whether you're building a SaaS app, whether you're building, a banking mobile app, whether you're building, the Disney Plus app, like any of these things, Uber, whatever, there's some sort of client that exists that your customers interact with. And there's a ton of other software that's written behind the scenes, internal dashboards, admin panels, cron jobs, scripts, all this kind of stuff that sort of honestly keeps the company held together that is often not visible to the outside world. And so our thought was like, a lot of the problems, a lot of the reasons it's hard to build this kind of software are sort of the same at every company. Let's say you have some script that does some business specific piece of logic. In order to turn that into a robust enterprise grade internal tool, you have to make sure there's a good UI in front of it. You have to make sure it's permissioned, so only the right people have access to it. You have to make sure there's some sort of audit log every time it's run. You have to make sure there's like a notification system and letting people know when things are running and things like that. You have to make sure that there's like a way to sort of like handle the kind of infrastructure side. If you run some operations of running in the right context, is it going to take up too many resources, all that sort of thing. And so that's the reason like engineers just write a quick script and don't bother with any of that stuff, because that stuff is consuming and annoying. But it's also the same. So our thought is, can we give like you a set of building blocks that lets you sort of automate all that boilerplate, the stuff that's largely the same at most companies, and just configure it with a couple of clicks, so that you as an engineer can handle just the quick back-end logic of that operation, and we'll handle the rest. And so that was kind of the idea behind Airplane. We pitched it to some folks, put together some slides, and like built a really quick prototype, and people were like, yeah, that's pretty nifty. I think I would use this if you built it.
Yeah, you're uncovering some trauma for me, for sure. As a CTO myself, I probably spent half my time building these internal tools, half my time building the product, and then half my time building and managing the team, which obviously is more than 100%.
Yeah.
But the exactly type of use cases would come up often, whether it's they need to modify some customer data, they need to, they just need to get their hands in the system for some reason. And so I would create these absolute garbage, like PHP web apps, and hand it to them, be like, just here, stop asking me to do it. Yeah. And of course, like they wouldn't be great. They wouldn't have any kind of error handling or audit logging or anything. And, they'd come back and they'd want them to be enhanced. And I'm like, I wrote this in 30 minutes. I was probably drunk. Like, don't ask me to maintain this thing. Just get away from me. But those kinds of things happen constantly. And, early on in the startup days, you're doing a lot of this stuff manually. But as you get to growth and scale, these things become much more important. And you mentioned around safety and security, like it becomes a lot easier to screw up data, especially, I'm building a tool. Like I said, I built some tool, spent 30 minutes on it, and now the database has changed. And I don't even remember that tool even exists. That's not an officially supported tool, but there's somebody in some department whose job depends on that thing with no documentation or anything. And all of a sudden it breaks. And either now they're stuck in their job, or worse, they're actually now damaging or ruining or deleting data. So this is definitely a big problem. So obviously, I'm sure every CTO that's watching or listening out there is feeling the same pain. If you're a founder, know that your CTO and your team is going through this pain. So, pay attention. This is important. So anyway, so where do you go from here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you hit the nail on the head in terms of describing the problem. I've spoken to so many people who kind of describe it the same way. They've hacked together these random, these days it's less PHP and more, Django admin and these kinds of like off-the-shelf tools to kind of get at some of these problems, but then no safety controls, no permissioning. People still make mistakes, don't input validations. People accidentally delete all the data in the database. Backups, like that kind of stuff happens at companies all the time. And so that's sort of the status quo at many, many organizations. And so we decided that we could build a SaaS around it, essentially. And so we started working on Airplane kind of officially in 2020, December 2020. That's when we probably wrote the first lines of code and started building a prototype. The first version of Airplane was really, really simple. Basically, the way it worked is you'd write a script in, let's say, Python or JavaScript or something like that. And that script could be whatever you wanted. It wasn't something Airplane specific. You could sort of say, okay, the script goes into the database and deletes a user based on a user ID parameter that you added to that's one of the parameters that the script takes in. And then so that was what you would write. And then you would deploy that to Airplane. And then within the Airplane UI, you basically configure a bunch of data, like metadata about how that script should run. So you'd say, here's the parameters it takes in, here's the input validation rules, here's who on my team has access to it, what identity groups and whatnot have access to it. Here's who should get notified when this thing is run, and sort of things like that. So it was really, really simple concept. And we probably had like an early version out by like maybe February or March of 2021. And then we had like, I think literally one company that was sort of using it in kind of a sort of beta state. We were seeing a lot of their feedback and iterating a lot. And then by April or May, we got a couple other early beta customers on board as well. Small companies, 20 to 50 person startups, that kind of thing, but friends of ours who were willing to take a shot and on a tool. But despite them being kind of friendly, they weren't just doing us a favor. We kind of saw that like it would get in here with like 1 or 2 scripts, and then people would start adding more stuff to it, but getting more users onto the platform, all that kind of stuff. And then so by like probably June of 2021, we had like probably 3 companies where there was like a good 10, 15 people in the organization logging into it every day and running things off the platform. They were adding more and more scripts to it over time. And we thought, okay, there's something valuable here in terms of the value we're creating for these companies. And so we decided to just launch the product. I think, a lot of SaaS companies, a lot of SaaS startups like stay in stealth for a long time and go up for validation. But my viewpoint is we did the same thing with Heap, which was we just, once there's even a little bit of product market fit, just like launch the damn thing and get it in people's hands as fast as possible. So that's what we did. July 2021, we ended up launching the product, and we got a fair amount of interest pretty quickly. That interest didn't necessarily mean we had like nailed it right away. There was a lot of ways in which people resonated with the core concept, but had a lot of feature requests and reasons for which it didn't fully solve the problem. So it was probably good, another good sort of 6 to 12 months of iteration to really get to that repeatable, scalable kind of product market fit. But that's kind of the quick sort of early story of how we, got out the gate.
Yeah. So you launched it. Now you were getting paid customers.
Yeah.
They were giving you a lot of feedback. So how did you kind of manage that feedback to understand, like how did you hone in on that scalable product market fit?
Yeah, it's a good question. We've been fortunate. There's been a lot of interest from more or less day one of launching the product. That doesn't mean there's been a lot of customers from day one, but we had, those few beta customers. We did like a launch on, Hacker News, Product Hunt, these kind of communities where startups hang out. And we also just pitched to a lot of our friends and people in our network. A lot of people we've done that initial sort of validation conversations with. We're like, hey, you said you thought that was interesting. Maybe you should use it. And so we got a lot of our initial customers that way. And really, we just spent a lot of time with them and listened to them. I think there's, we did use analytics. You can see that in the data, but I think a lot of the things that really took us from like cool early product to like real valuable product market fit that's repeatable and scalable ended up being things that are actually kind of hard to see in analytics because they have to end up being like ways to expand the platform to sort of offer a lot more functionality before I think it really felt like it sort of like worked. And so what I mean by that specifically, as I mentioned, the initial version of Airplane, you could deploy a script, it'll turn it into sort of like a web app that someone can execute on your team, which is a good fit for some internal operations. It's very much not a good fit for many others. And so what typically happens is, let's say you're a company like the one you previously led, and you have a bunch of people coming to you saying like, I need this tool to do this, and I need a tool to do that. If some of those fit into Airplane, but some of them don't, it's kind of hard to adopt Airplane for it. Because you're like, well, I'm going to have to tell them to go to Airplane for some of these things, and then tell them to go to this different system of hack together for another set of things, and maybe a third system for another set of things. And so while some companies were happy with that sort of equilibrium, most companies were more like, hey, unless you're able to do a little bit more, we're not going to be able to use the product. And so the script paradigm is really good for something that's kind of compute heavy or write heavy, something that's sort of a long running task or something like that. It's not actually that great for something that's more read heavy. If you want to visualize data or do a lookup, if you're like, hey, I just like view data about a customer, type in their name, do a search, find all the matching customers, click on the one that matches, see some data about them. It's actually kind of hard to model as a script. And so we ended up basically having to add more affordances for building more complicated UIs in the product. And then we also had to add some affordances around like orchestration. So people are like, hey, I have a 5-step process here. I can model that as 5 different scripts or something like that in Airplane, but then I'll have to write a doc to tell my team how to like execute these things one after the other. Really, you should have some sort of form of orchestration. So we ended up building that as well. Basically, the ability to trigger things from other things and have sort of that kind of logic around stuff. And so once we kind of released some basic features around UI building and orchestration, all of a sudden people were like, hey, actually for 90 to 100% of everything I want to build from an internal tooling perspective, Airplane can actually cover it. And so if we adopt this platform, and sort of pay that kind of learning curve and cost and all that kind of stuff, it's going to actually be really worth it. We can trust this as a sort of end-to-end system. And so since we've kind of like broadened the platform to include those things, we've then started getting repeatable sort of enterprise revenue and things like that.
So there's two things that you mentioned that called out to me around product market fit. One is you knew your customers, right? You said they were your friends and colleagues and so on. So one of the biggest things when I'm working with founders around identifying their core personas or their core market is if it's not you and your community, it has to be a community that you have access to.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of founders, unfortunately, will try to create something for a market that they aren't a part of, or they're an outsider, or they just truly don't understand. And so there's a lot of work that has to get done into not only creating empathy and understanding, but then also even getting access to them so that they would even talk to you and give you their feedback at any stage, whether it's early on with the idea or on through as you're building your product. Because somebody needs to be able to trust you enough to even give you their time. So in fact, some of the founders I've worked with, I've actually coached them on a detour to say, you're not ready to build this platform that you want to build because you're an outsider. Go start an agency and serve that community, become an insider, and then start marketing those or shopping those ideas around. And I actually have a client right now that's probably listening who took a couple of years, that went down this detour, built this thriving agency, and now his customers are actually investing in his platform. And now he's come back to me to help him build the SaaS platform. So access and becoming an insider is absolutely key, especially at the early stages.
For sure.
You didn't talk about your product in terms of features. You talked about it in terms of goals or use cases, right? Things that the customers want to accomplish.
Yeah.
And I think too many founders focus on features or things, these sort of tangible widgets that I can put a name on and brand it and sell it, and not so much about, well, what is the customer actually trying to do? So we built this script engine. Yeah, that's great. That fits a certain use case, but they have this broader context that they're trying to accomplish that this kind of sort of jams into, but not really super well. So they've got to duct tape these scripts together. Okay, let's actually create this cohesive solution. And doing that in all these different ways, I think, is what ultimately had everything kind of hone in and resonate. So thinking about your customer in terms of what are the goals they want to accomplish, what are the use cases or scenarios that drive them towards those goals. And then, all right, there's different things we can build that we can tie together and create that solution.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, very few people said, I want you to build a UI builder into Airplane.
Right.
It's very rare that you heard that specific sentence. Occasionally someone would try to pitch you on that idea or something. But for the most part, people say like, Airplane doesn't quite solve all my needs. And you dig in like, what does that mean? You know, and they kind of articulate it in probably a much less concise way than the way I expressed it to you. And it obviously takes you sometimes 6 months or 12 months to really internalize it inside yourself, because not everyone packages it up in the exact way that you sort of interpret it. You know, people weren't necessarily saying exactly that, but you spend enough time with your customers, you really get to know those use cases super deeply. And you will at some point kind of internalize, okay, this is what's really going on. And this is what's really missing in our product. And so, there's definitely a bit of a, you can't substitute for, knowing your customers really deeply.
Yeah. Awesome. So you've gotten to that product market fit. Now, where are you now in terms of scale?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm not going to share exact revenue numbers, but sub 10 million in ARR. So single digit millions, that kind of range. The team is 20. It's 19 people today. We have a few people joining in a week, so it'll be actually 23 people very soon. And so still a pretty small team, mostly engineering. We are starting to build the go-to-market side now that we're sort of seeing that repeatable product market fit and things like that.
So what are some of the growing pains that you're dealing with now?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few, I'd say. Number one is just like, when you sort of flip from not having product market to having product market fit, all of a sudden, like, there's so much to do. So like the support volume goes through the roof, the number of customer meetings that are happening on a week-to-week basis kind of goes to the roof, and it feels like it all sort of happens at once. So we're actually scrambling a little bit to catch up to sort of the growth and the stage the company's at. So I mentioned there's 4 new people starting in the next couple of weeks. That's kind of, that hiring is there to sort of keep up with the kind of growth that is sort of naturally happening. And so I'd say that's the biggest one, is just being a little bit behind on a couple hires relative to what the company needs. I'd say the other growing pains are, another sort of symptom of kind of product market fit and having a lot of customers and a growing number of customers is the set of kind of requests explodes very quickly. So then instead of things people need and the diversity of the customer base and all that kind of stuff grows really, really quickly. And so there is, like, I think, real decision making to be done around, like, do we double down on what's working for our SMB mid-market customers? Do we sort of explore some directions that are affecting our enterprise customers, even though we have a lot fewer of those? Like, there's these kinds of things that there's a little bit of like sequencing questions you have to put, you have to ask and figure
out. The strategy becomes more complex.
For sure.
Yeah. So the way I like to describe product market fit, it's like the eye of a hurricane. So as you're driving towards product market fit, there's so much work, you're pushing this boulder up the hill and everything is on kind of supply side. And then things start to click and it gets a little bit easier and it's almost like you start floating, right?
Yeah.
Things become effortless. Sales start coming in. You don't have to work as hard you're not constantly changing things because it's starting to dial in. Okay, great. Now you've got this moment of almost just sort of floating, if you will.
Yeah.
And then scale starts to take over. Now there's a whole different set of challenges and all this chaos and things are getting ripped apart at the seams. And honestly, I personally believe that the scale stage is much more chaotic and much more hectic even than pre-product market fit.
Definitely.
Even though you're scrappy and there's a lot of ways that things can fail in the early stages, you're forced to be very focused on a few number of things. But then at the scale stage, everything just gets multiplied. So those are definitely some familiar challenges. So how are you kind of tackling that at this stage? How are you getting after that kind of repeatability and setting yourself up for scale?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a little bit of hiring on the sales side and things like that we need to do and have done. We have a few people joining. But yeah, I think the other thing I think we at Heap, I think we were very reactive. As like became on fire problems, we would sort of hire people or do whatever was needed to kind of fix that problem. And that worked well enough, but it also meant you were kind of perpetually feeling behind. And some of that can't be avoided. And you also don't want to hire too much out of need and things like that. But I think one thing we've done really well at Airplane, which we never really did early days at Heap, is we've invested very heavily into content early on, which is, I think, a very sort of like scalable growth strategy. And so you sort of see that where kind of our SEO traffic and all that kind of stuff has just been sort of steadily ticking up for the last year and a half. And so as a product market fit is set on the product side, the sort of demand is already kind of there to sort of fulfill it. And so the ability to hit kind of higher and higher revenue targets and stuff like that, while that's not guaranteed by any means, I think we have there's less amount of like pushing a boulder up the hill that we're going to need to do because we've sort of laid the foundation for that a little bit.
Yeah. So how do you think your role is changing now as a leader?
It's still not changing that much. I mean, I still spend most of my time talking to customers and thinking about product. And so I do think some founders give that up a little bit too quickly, where they move away from the customer conversation, say, I just now hire people to sort of do it. And you do to some extent, but some things can't be substituted. I think the founder just has to have a strong connection to customers at any scale. And you see this in the best SaaS leaders. You take someone like, Mark Benioff at Salesforce, he still gets on jets and visits customers in person and things like that. Yep. And so that part is not changing. I don't think will ever change. And still the majority of the time I spend is sort of customer facing. That aside, I think a little bit more time has been spent on hiring and things like that. We've been a little bit more deliberate about headcount planning and doing things like that.
Yeah, I always say that is the number one thing that you should do that doesn't scale is talk to customers. I don't care if you're an early stage startup or the CEO of a Fortune 1 company. If you don't have personal relationships with your customers and you aren't engaging with them regularly, you're just out of touch. Everything becomes a telephone game, and you can't lead that way if you're out of touch with your customers. So good for you. That's definitely gonna lead to a lot of success in the future. So what are you struggling with as a leader at this stage?
Yeah, it's a good question. Honestly, the prioritization and strategy has just become more complex very quickly because the product service area is more complicated. We have more customers. There's more things to do. And so there's real decisions that need to be made around what do we react to in terms of feedback? What can we ignore for a little bit? What do we prioritize versus not prioritize? And so those things are, we have the customer input. We have that sort of tight catch for our customers, but there's a little bit of needing to predict the future a little bit about what's going to lead to the most growth and stuff like that a year from now, 2 years from now. So I think those kind of prioritization questions are really hard. And I think we got a lot of them wrong in the sort of middle stages of Heap. I think it's a lot better now, but between, 5 and 20 million of ARR at Heap, I think there was a lot of things that we could have done that would have led to a lot more growth later if we had sort of gotten them really correct. And so I think there was just some lost cycles there because of less than stellar kind of, that kind of product decision making and strategic decision making. And so I want to make sure not to sort of hit the same pitfalls this time around. Yeah.
Do you have a framework or a scorecard of some kind for prioritizing?
Honestly, no.
Wow.
There are many out there, but I found it that every company does things a little bit differently here. I talk to lots of other founders and get a sense of how they've grappled with these things, and It's sort of different all across the board. For some things doing something very personal. I think for Heap, so the stuff that we did wrong was, Heap is like a product analytics tool. The vast majority of Heap's customers are product managers or VPs of product and product teams, essentially. That realization took 5 or 6 years to figure out. Because analytics is a really general purpose thing. A lot of people who are using Heap were marketing teams, engineers, data teams, product teams. Those are probably the 4 main ones. But when we were probably like 4 or 5 million in ARR, there was like a real bit of an identity crisis of like, hey, we have all these different constituencies. We can't build a product that serves all of these people really, really well. And so that needs to be sort of, we have to pick a lane and figure out what the actual best persona is. And then we just kind of didn't. We tried to sort of be all things to all people and end up building a product that wasn't really deep enough to anyone in any one way. It was too complicated for some set of people and not complicated enough for other sets of people. And so it was a really long time to figure out what's the actual North Star of the company, what's the right persona. And so I think with Airplane, the problem is not quite that bad. Airplane sells to engineers, so it is at least one business function within the company, but there is that sort of like SMB versus mid-market versus enterprise, very different sets of needs and buyers and things like that. There's a sort of user-buyer distinction where like what engineering leadership wants from a tool like Airplane, from what an individual engineer wants from the tool. And so I think those things can get complicated. And there's like not one right answer, honestly, to solve these things, other than you have to pick something. You can't sort of make certain decisions. So I'd say that's the maybe the only framework is you got to pick something.
Yeah, I get in this debate a lot. I'm still pretty bullish about creating some kind of scorecard for features internally, and I have so many different models and decks, and they change over time. But essentially, I like some kind of a weighted sum where there are different factors that are important to you strategically. Yeah, and it could be a funnel, right? User acquisition, retention, revenue, et cetera, like pirate metrics. It could be affinity to whatever our strategic objectives are, right? Yep. So this feature aligns with, at a high level, right? We scored a 5 in alignment with this strategic goal that we've said, which is like, we're going after enterprise or whatever. And in some cases, it might be, number of customer requests or, how much feedback signal are we getting? So there's a lot of different factors you can take in. And then every quarter, I like to say, well, let's just put our weights. Like, how important are these different things to us as a business? Yeah. And then, it's not to say that it's the end all be all, but it frames the debate. And the key thing or the key value of some kind of a scorecard like this is we want to get away from the soft, fuzzy opinions of the loud people in the room, the hippos, the highly paid people's opinions, right? Yeah. Or the loud voices in the room, and really just say, well, the way we decide on what to build is based on these factors we've all agreed on. And so when we're having a debate, we say, well, how much do we think this feature is going to impact this goal or retention or revenue? It just kind of frames the discussion in a more logical way. And it just comes to better decision making. And it's also something too that you can measure, because then we can also say, well, how are we going to measure retention? Obviously it's somewhat straightforward, but how do we measure the impact or the success on this big strategic objective? Okay, cool. Measure it, tie it back. And then again, you can say, well, how well are we actually doing at making these decisions? Yeah. So I'm fine with, startups that do something very, very simple. Yeah. It could even just be like one OKR and like, that's all we care about, all the way up to, large companies I've worked with that might have a dozen different factors and they spend weeks and months, debating and scoring and rescoring and so on. Obviously there's a point at which it becomes too much. But anyway, so I'm pretty bullish on that approach to prioritization, even if the model itself is pretty simple. So how do you react to that kind of intuitively?
Yeah, honestly, I like that approach. It's not super complicated, and it's following implicitly what we're doing anyway. It's like everything you kind of described. We're not putting weights on things, but we're sort of implicitly putting weights on things, the way you discuss things. And I think formalizing it and adding, like taking your intuitions, when you say X is important and Y is less important, turning that into actual numbers, I think does actually help frame that discussion a little bit better. I like that.
Yeah, cool. Well, I'm happy to send you I've got the tools and stuff. I could send over my old spreadsheets. Awesome. No, great. Well, so we're kind of coming up on the hour here. We'd like to wrap up, but I'd love to, get any kind of final messages or thoughts or advice that you'd give to other founders that might be following in your footsteps?
Yeah. I would say, I mean, there's probably a lot of takeaways, honestly, we're making. I feel like kind of a few big things that I think we did really well at both Heap and Airplane, and also some mistakes made that I think someone could sort of avoid. I think we did really well is we stayed really lean pre-product market fit at both companies. We didn't sort of overhire. That was, I think, honestly, the default in 2013 when we started Heap. You kind of knew not to hire until you really needed to. But 2020 and 2021, the fundraising market got a little out of whack. There were some really, really big teams there where people built really big companies that didn't have any product market fit. And you've seen some high-profile failures. I think there was still this collective idea that you need a lot of people to find product market fit. And for a pure SaaS software business, I think that's rarely true. So I think that's one thing we did well. I think things we can do better at Heap that hopefully we'll do a little bit better over at Airplane. We are talking about the product prioritization and things like that. I think really just picking the right set of North Star metrics and the right set of North Star customers and ideal customer profile. Like that kind of stuff is not easy to get right, but you can't just like kick the can on the road and not actually solve those problems. So you have to have alignment about what it is. Who are we going after? Who are we not going after? All that kind of stuff. Getting that stuff right early on, and then using that as the through line on your product prioritization. So many problems. Doesn't solve all the problems, but it's all.
I like that. Clarifying your identity and using that to drive your decisions moving forward. Yeah,
for sure. So I think those are the two things that, there's a lot of little things you have to get right. But like if you get those big things right, a lot of things fall into place.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. This was really great. It was a fun conversation. So thanks for coming on.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me on.